I'm going to wear my headdress so we can look gorgeous together, Leia.
Oh, so you're wearing the fancy one this time.
This is actually mine. This is, I'm really looking forward to my Wix bosses getting my expense claim for this hat. It didn't cost very much. I just want to piss my boss off by expensing a stupid hat. It was a unicorn tiara last month.
I think you should make that hat a part of your everyday wardrobe.
As a fashion advisor and consultant, I shall. Has my microphone gone off?
Yeah.
Ah, well, I'll just shout. So, what got you into web development?
So I got into web development in 2005. We were making a forum with a friend of mine, and at some point we had to make some changes. And back then, there were no plugins, so you made changes by copying and pasting changes to the PHP code. So I looked at it, and I was like, that kind of makes sense. So I got into PHP, and then later on JavaScript, and later on I got more interested in CSS, and that kind of stuck. But I got into programming much earlier, like 7 years before that. I was like 11. I was really interested in making things, and at that time, I had a fascination with fonts, actually. I really wanted to design my own font. So when we visited the US with my family, my uncle took me to this huge department store called CompUSA, and I thought, maybe I can find font design software here. So I looked around and looked and looked and looked, and I could not find font design software. I could only find like CDs with fonts. So as I was looking for font design software, I found this visual IDE that promised to help you make apps without programming. And back then, I was really scared of code. I was interested in programming, but I was too scared to learn code. But that seemed approachable. That seemed like something I could do. So I got that, and I was making apps with that for like a year. I remember I was working a lot on like this drawing app that let people make graphics, like automated graphics, like grids and things like that. And after a year, I wanted to learn. I was ready, so I got a book about C++, and it was this thick, because back then, like, that's how you learned. There was no, single thing. It was so hard. So I was like, okay, maybe C++ is not for me yet. So I got a book on Visual Basic, and that I could understand. So I did Visual Basic for 7 years until that forum.
What is it that excites you about CSS? Because certainly when I'm looking at the mailing lists, you're a prolific poster.
There are many things that excite me about CSS. Some of them are smaller, like conic gradients that I've been pushing for 5 years and finally are getting implemented. Other things are like the attribute function, which many people have been pushing for years and is not getting implemented. Most of the things that actually excite me are things that are not getting implemented. I'm also really excited about Houdini. Outside CSS, I'm excited about web components because I think they have the power to bring web development, to make web development more approachable. I feel that in the last few years, web development has been focusing on like JavaScript too much, and I feel that like there are many, many people that are comfortable with HTML and CSS but cannot write much JavaScript. And I feel that used right, web components can bring back web development to these people. Like because even if they cannot write a web component of their own, they can use existing web components, so they can do more by just writing HTML, which is also something that my research at MIT is focusing around, like making programming possible with just HTML. And I see Houdini as the set of Houdini specs as sort of a similar thing. Like it's extending what CSS can do, just like web components are extending what HTML can do. And both of these are very worthy goals because they empower HTML and CSS authors to do much more without having to code.
I absolutely hear you. I mean, we haven't discussed this before, but that's exactly what excites me about Houdini and components. Quick show of hands. Is everybody familiar with Houdini?
Okay, so we should probably explain what Houdini actually is.
Go for it.
So Houdini actually comes from the famous magician, because the premise is to bring browser magic to developers, like things that were previously accessible only to browser developers, for example, adding new CSS functions, things like that, registering new CSS properties, all those kinds of things will now be accessible to web developers. Like, web developers will be able to define their own functions that create CSS images, for example. We don't have to wait for browsers to implement conic gradients because we would be able to make our own gradients, for example. Or similarly, like, we don't have to wait for browsers to implement CSS properties or new layout modes or like new CSS syntax structures, because we'll be able to do our own things and implement our own CSS features and share them with other people so they can use them much faster than waiting for all browsers to implement them across the board. And this will also be very useful for polyfills too. Today, writing a CSS polyfill is a huge pain in the ass. Like, I'm not sure if you've ever tried to write a CSS polyfill or anything that does anything on CSS code. Like, basically, because browsers drop everything they cannot understand, when you cannot access the things that the browser couldn't parse. So to write a CSS polyfill, you have to fetch the entire CSS file via, you have to like send an AJAX request, fetch the CSS file, parse it yourself, because there's no way, like the browser doesn't offer you any way to parse the CSS. You have to like include a fully fledged parser, make the small change that you wanted to actually make, and then inject it in a style element. So this is really horrible. Like, compare that to making polyfills for HTML or JavaScript, which is much easier. So there's a lot of room for improvement there, and I'm glad that Houdini is going the way to actually make this improvement.
It's Houdini was not only an escape artist, but he had a vehement dislike of fake mediums, people who claimed to be able to speak to the dead. And what he would do is he would go to these mediums' shows and stand up and explain to the audience how this magic was occurring. So that's one of the reasons it's called Houdini, because it's explaining the magic behind CSS. And it's part of the wider initiative called the Extensible Web Manifesto, which is basically all the things that are in browsers which you didn't have access to, you get access to. So something like Service Worker, now you can access the bit between the browser and the network, which you never could before.
Yep.
It always was in the browsers, it's just you didn't have access to it, and now you do. So you're doing a PhD. Where's that, Boston?
Yep, at MIT.
And what is it about? Is it interesting?
So the broader field is computer science, more specifically human-computer interaction, which is like just a fancy academic term for usability. Because just academics like having their own terms for everything. And more specifically, it's about making web programming more accessible to more people. So we feel that developers end up coding the same interactions again and again and again. Like, so many applications are basically CRUD, like create, read, update, delete, like just editing a collection of data with or nested collections, or basically just editing data on a page and being able to add items and delete items. Like, this is, someone had a series of slides yesterday showing like how pervasive this pattern is. Mm-hmm. So we felt that people shouldn't have to write JavaScript to do this. Like, this should be doable with just HTML. So I started working on this HTML-based language called Mavo 3 years ago, and we released it last year to the public as an open source project. So if you think it's interesting, you could contribute. It's a pretty open source project. We would welcome contributions. If you think the vision is worthwhile, like we could really use the contributions. It's spelled Mavo, M-A-V-O, and you can look at it at mavo.io.
Perhaps you could tweet the link afterwards so people can have a look.
Yes, that's probably a good idea.
It's really interesting. It's a really interesting project. We're out of time, but please give it up for a great friend of mine and a great friend of the open web, Lea Verou.